Penguin Random House Audio presents The Trouble with Innocence by Michael Hall, from Texas Monthly, March 2017. Read for you by Christopher Ryan Grant. June 6, 2016. Convicted murderer Kerry Max Cook walked into a Tyler courtroom. The 60-year-old was dressed in black, his silver hair trimmed short. Cook's eyes, dark and nervous, shot around the wood-paneled chamber, which was filling rapidly. Local news reporters and a documentary film crew from New York were setting up cameras and microphones. Cook caught sight of 3 men in the audience, men who had once been convicted criminals themselves: Billy Smith, Michael Morton, and A.B. Butler, Jr. All 3, famously, had been proved innocent of their alleged crimes after serving a collective 60 years behind bars. They had come from miles away to attend this hearing, and Cook walked over to greet them. Smiling, the 3 stood to shake his hand. Morton clapped him on the shoulder. Cook, who has a big, square face, smiled too. He had fought for almost 4 decades to get to this moment. In 1978, a jury found him guilty of the murder of Linda Jo Edwards, a 22-year-old Tyler secretary whose body was discovered in her apartment, bludgeoned and mutilated. The case confounded the city's investigators and prosecutors with its gruesomeness, and Cook became known as a monster and a deviant, the most notorious killer in Smith County. Over the years, the county's prosecutors had sought 4 different times to send Cook to death row. But Cook had always claimed he was innocent, saying he'd had no motive to kill Edwards. Though his protests garnered little attention early on, eventually his case attracted a number of sympathizers and advocates, some who re-examined the evidence and others who represented him in court for his numerous appeals. Cook and his supporters had clashed fiercely with Smith County, making repeated headlines, and he had become a celebrity worldwide, an indelible symbol, at least outside Tyler, of the overreach of the Texas criminal justice system. His story was dramatized in both a play and a movie, and Cook grew into an anti-death penalty hero, accumulating thousands of friends and followers on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. One of his fans, Madonna, had recently posted a short video made by New York fashion photographer Stephen Klein about Cook. "Join me and Stephen Klein," she wrote, "in his long struggle to prove his innocence and clear his name." Now, finally, Cook had been granted this hearing to determine whether his conviction should be thrown out at last. Scanning the room, he recognized many of the players who had moved his case through the courts. Up front was Scott Howe, who had represented him in the 80s, sitting next to Paul Nugent, who had done so in the 90s. In the back was Nugent's adversary, David Dobbs, the prosecutor who, for 8 years, had tried relentlessly to have Cook executed. Also present was Jim McCloskey, an investigator for Cook whose research had led to an exhaustive report naming another man, Edwards' boyfriend, as her killer. That man, James Mayfield, was in the courthouse too, waiting in a hallway for his turn to testify. 40 years earlier, Mayfield had been a brazen Lothario, carrying on a 17-month affair with Edwards, who was half his age, under his wife's nose. On this day, though, the 82-year-old sat quietly, wearing a green t-shirt and spectacles, looking tired. Cook took a seat at a table in front of the judge's dais. Next to his lawyers, Gary Udishin, the president of the board of directors of the Innocence Project of Texas, and Nina Morrison from the National Innocence Project. Across from them were the district attorney of Smith County, Matt Bingham, and 2 assistants. The 6 sat in awkward silence as they waited for the judge to appear. Finally, Cook whispered something to Morrison, putting his arm around her shoulder. She leaned in and whispered something back. Moments later, at 9:30, Judge Jack Carter climbed into his seat, banged his gavel, and announced to the world what Cook and his lawyers already knew. Peering over the bench, the judge declared in a deep East Texas accent that as of that morning, the state had agreed to recommend that Cook's conviction be set aside. He was, for all practical purposes, exonerated. Quickly, Udishin, whose graying eyebrows and glasses give him an owlish look, rose from his seat and addressed the court. He and Bingham had struck a deal, he explained. In return for the prosecution's acknowledging that Cook's due process rights had been violated by the state's use of false testimony in earlier trials, the defense had agreed to relinquish 6 of its 8 claims, including several that alleged prosecutorial misconduct. The defense would still fight for Cook to be declared actually innocent of the murder, a legal claim for which his lawyers would need to offer powerful new evidence. If Cook was ruled actually innocent, he would be entitled to about $3 million in compensation for 19 years behind bars. Then, Udishin's words took a curious turn, at least to those familiar with his client's long-standing battle with Smith County and its prosecutors. The lawyer began to praise Bingham for his openness and assistance. "We deal with these kinds of cases, and we deal with DAs around the country," said Udishin, "and the ability of justice to be done in a case largely depends on the ability or the willingness of the DA to cooperate, to let us review their files. The way Mr. Bingham handled this is a model for how to deal with these types of situations." When Udishin finished, Bingham, a bald and bearded man who carries himself with the confidence of a successful prosecutor, stood and spoke briefly. He was followed by the judge, who announced that the agreement would go to the state's highest criminal tribunal, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, for approval. He excused the witnesses. There would be no testimony now, and declared that the hearing on Cook's actual innocence would take place later that month. Then, he banged his gavel. The whole thing was over in 13 minutes. Cook, who had remained impassive throughout, rose slowly. He hugged his lawyers and crossed into the gallery to embrace his wife, Sandy Pressey. Then, followed by the scrum of supporters and reporters, he made his way down the stairs and outside, where he stood in front of the courthouse to have his photo taken with his defense team, the 3 other exonerees, and his family. Cook seemed more impatient than exuberant, smiling thinly for the cameras. At one point, he looked out over the milling crowd and watched as a stooped man with white hair and a walker made his way slowly down the sidewalk. It was Mayfield, heading toward an SUV that would take him home to Houston. An hour later, at a celebratory lunch at Outback Steakhouse, Cook sat with a large group of lawyers and friends, listening as they told stories, laughed, and toasted one another for the day's hard-earned results. It was the end of an era. Cook had arrived on death row in 1978 and was finally getting justice, like other Texas men who had been condemned to death before him and also won their freedom. Randall Dale Adams, Clarence Brandley, Ernest Willis, and Anthony Graves. The day should have been the happiest of Cook's life, but instead, Cook seemed preoccupied, not quite present. Something was bothering him, and 2 days later, he wrote an email to his lawyers and several journalists to explain. He could not accept the praise that Udishin had heaped that day upon Bingham and, by extension, Bingham's predecessors, who had sought his misery and death for so long. He was firing his lawyers, he declared. Then, he posted the email on Facebook and followed it with a series of rants accusing his lawyers of collaborating with the enemy. His words grew more and more hysterical until finally, Cook announced that he needed a new attorney, one who would help him withdraw the agreement and restore me with a wrongful murder conviction. Even his closest supporters thought he was crazy. "I'm frankly devastated by this recent development," wrote a blogger on a sympathetic criminal justice site. Around the country, observers scratched their heads, as did other exonerees, many of whom had also worked with Udishin and Morrison. What kind of person would fire two of the best lawyers?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?